Section 23 of Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Section 23. He began very cautiously to open his eyes, to see whether a gramophone was really there. But real things were too exciting. He must be cautious. He would not go mad. First he looked at the fashion papers on the lower shelf, then gradually at the gramophone with the green trumpet. Nothing could be more exact. And so, gathering courage, he looked at the sideboard, the plate of bananas, the engraving of Queen Victoria and the Prince Consort, at the mantelpiece with the jar of roses. None of these things moved. All were still. All were real. "She is a woman with a spiteful tongue," said Risha. "What does Mr. Peters do?" Septimus asked. "Ah," said Risha, trying to remember. She thought Mrs. Filmer had said that he travelled for some company. "Just now he is in Hull," she said. Just now. She said that with her Italian accent. She said that herself. He shaded his eyes so that he might see only a little of her face at a time, first the chin, then the nose, then the forehead, in case it were deformed, or had some terrible mark on it. But no, there she was, perfectly natural, sewing, with the pursed lips that women have, the set, the melancholy expression when sewing. But there was nothing terrible about it, he assured himself, looking a second time, a third time at her face, her hands, for what was frightening or disgusting in her as she sat there in broad daylight sewing? Mrs. Peters had a spiteful tongue. Mr. Peters was in Hull. Why then rage and prophesy? Why fly scourged and outcast? Why be made to tremble and sob by the clouds? Why seek truths and deliver messages when Risha sat sticking pins into the front of her dress and Mr. Peters was in Hull? Miracles, revelations, agonies, loneliness, falling through the sea, down, down into the flames, all were burnt out, for he had a sense, as he watched Risha trimming the straw hat for Mrs. Peters, of a coverlet of flowers. "It's too small for Mrs. Peters," said Septimus. For the first time for days he was speaking as he used to do. Of course it was, absurdly small, she said, but Mrs. Peters had chosen it. He took it out of her hands. He said it was an organ-grinder's monkey's hat. How it rejoiced her that. Not for weeks had they laughed like this together, poking fun privately like married people. What she meant was that if Mrs. Filmer had come in, or Mrs. Peters, or anybody, they would not have understood what she and Septimus were laughing at. "There," she said, pinning a rose to one side of the hat. Never had she felt so happy, never in her life. But that was still more ridiculous, Septimus said. Now the poor woman looked like a pig at a fair. Nobody ever made her laugh as Septimus did. What had she got in her workbox? She had ribbons and beads, tassels, artificial flowers. She tumbled them out on the table. He began putting odd colours together, for though he had no fingers, could not even do up a parcel, he had a wonderful eye, and often he was right, sometimes absurd, of course, but sometimes wonderfully right. "She shall have a beautiful hat," he murmured, taking up this and that, Risha kneeling by his side, looking over his shoulder. Now it was finished, that is to say the design, she must stitch it together. But she must be very, very careful, he said, to keep it just as he had made it. So she sewed. When she sewed, he thought, she made a sound like a kettle on the hob, bubbling, murmuring, always busy, her strong little pointed fingers pinching and poking, her needle flashing straight. The sun might go in and out on the tassels, on the wallpaper, but he would wait, he thought, stretching out his feet, looking at his ringed sock at the end of the sofa. He would wait in this warm place, the pocket of still air, which one comes on at the edge of a wood sometimes in the evening, when, because of a fall in the ground or some arrangement of the trees, one must be scientific, above all, scientific. Warmth lingers, and the air buffets the cheek like the wing of a bird. "There it is," said Risha, twirling Mrs. Peters' hat on the tips of her fingers. "That'll do for the moment. Later—" Her sentence bubbled away, drip, 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 like a contented tap left running. It was wonderful. Never had he done anything which made him feel so proud. It was so real, it was so substantial, Mrs. Peters' hat. "Just look at it," he said. Yes, it would always make her happy to see that hat. He had become himself then. He had laughed then. They had been alone together. Always she would like that hat. He told her to try it on. "But I must look so queer," she cried, running over to the glass and looking first this side, then that. Then she snatched it off again, for there was a tap at the door. Could it be Sir William Bradshaw? Had he sent already? No, it was only the small girl with the evening paper. What always happened, then happened. What happened every night of their lives. The small girl sucked her thumb at the door, Risha went down on her knees, Risha cooed and kissed, Risha got a bag of sweets out of the table drawer, for so it always happened. First one thing, then another. So she built it up, first one thing and then another. Dancing, skipping, round and round the room they went. He took the paper. Surrey was all out, he read. There was a heat wave, Risha repeated. Surrey was all out. There was a heat wave. Making it part of the game she was playing with Mrs. Filmer's grandchild, both of them laughing, chattering at the same time at their game. He was very tired. He was very happy. He would sleep. He shut his eyes. But directly he saw nothing, the sounds of the game became fainter and stranger, and sounded like the cries of people seeking and not finding, and passing further and further away. They had lost him. He started up in terror. What did he see? The plate of bananas on the sideboard. Nobody was there. Risha had taken the child to its mother. It was bedtime. That was it. To be alone forever. That was the doom pronounced in Milan when he came into the room and saw them cutting out buckram shapes with their scissors. To be alone forever. He was alone with the sideboard and the bananas. He was alone, exposed on this black eminence, stretched out, but not on a hilltop, not on a crag, on Mrs. Filmer's sitting-room sofa. As for the visions, the faces, the voices of the dead, where were they? There was a screen in front of him with black bulrushes and blue swallows. Where he had once seen mountains, where he had seen faces, where he had seen beauty, there was a screen. "Evans!" he cried. There was no answer. A mouse had squeaked, or a curtain rustled. Those were the voices of the dead. The screen, the coal scuttle, the sideboard remained to him. Let him then face the screen, the coal scuttle, and the sideboard. But Risha burst into the room, chattering. Some letter had come. Everybody's plans were changed. Mrs. Filmer would not be able to go to Brighton after all. There was no time to let Mrs. Williams know, and really Risha thought it very, very annoying when she caught sight of the hat and thought, perhaps she might just make a little... Her voice died out in contented melody. "Ah, damn!" she cried. It was a joke of theirs, her swearing. The needle had broken. Hat, child, Brighton, needle. She built it up. First one thing, then another. She built it up, sewing. She wanted him to say whether by moving the rose she had improved the hat. She sat on the end of the sofa. They were perfectly happy now, she said, suddenly, putting the hat down. For she could say anything to him now. She could say whatever came into her head. That was almost the first thing she had felt about him, that night in the cafe when he had come in with his English friends. He had come in rather shyly, looking round him, and his hat had fallen when he hung it up. That she could remember. She knew he was English, though not one of the large Englishmen her sister admired, for he was always thin, but he had a beautiful fresh colour, and with his big nose, his bright eyes, his way of sitting a little hunched made her think, she had often told him, of a young hawk, that first evening she saw him when they were playing dominoes, and he had come in, of a young hawk. But with her he was always very gentle. She had never seen him wild or drunk, only suffering sometimes through this terrible war. But even so, when she came in, he would put it all away. Anything in the whole world, any little bother with her work, anything that struck her to say, she would tell him, and he understood at once. Her own family even were not the same. Being older than she was, and being so clever, how serious he was, wanting her to read Shakespeare before she could even read a child's story in English. Being so much more experienced, he could help her, and she too could help him. But this hat now, and then it was getting late. Sir William Bradshaw. She held her hands to her head, waiting for him to say, did he like the hat or not? And as she sat there, waiting, looking down, he could feel her mind, like a bird, falling from branch to branch, and always alighting, quite rightly. He could follow her mind as she sat there in one of those loose, lax poses that came to her naturally, and if he should say anything, at once she smiled, like a bird alighting with all its claws firm upon the bough. But he remembered Bradshaw said, "The people we are most fond of are not good for us when we are ill." Bradshaw said he must be taught to rest. Bradshaw said they must be separated. Must. Why must? What power had Bradshaw over him? What right has Bradshaw to say must to me? He demanded. It is because you talked of killing yourself, said Risha. Mercifully, she could now say anything to Septimus. So he was in their power. Holmes and Bradshaw were on him. The brute with the red nostrils was snuffing into every secret place. Must, it could say. Where were his papers, the things he had written? She brought him his papers, the things he had written, things she had written for him. She tumbled them out onto the sofa. They looked at them together. Diagrams, designs, little men and women brandishing sticks for arms with wings, were they, on their backs? Circles traced round shillings and sixpences, the suns and stars, zigzagging precipices with mountaineers ascending, roped together, exactly like knives and forks, sea pieces with little faces laughing out of what might perhaps be waves, the map of the world. Burn them, he cried. Now for his writings, how the dead sing behind rhododendron bushes, odes to time, conversations with Shakespeare, Evans, Evans, Evans. His messages from the dead. Do not cut down trees. Tell the Prime Minister. Universal love, the meaning of the world. Burn them, he cried. But Risha laid her hands on them. Some were very beautiful, she thought. She would tie them up, for she had no envelope, with a piece of silk. Even if they took him, she said, she would go with him. They could not separate them against their wills, she said. End of section 23, read by Hannah Dormer. 10th of October 2021.